So now we'll hear from Leandro Carvalho, who is an assistant professor at the University of Southern California on genetics, economic choices, and income.
Thank you. Really, thank you so much for the opportunity. Really happy to be here. So we know a great deal about how environmental circumstances contribute to socioeconomic status, but we know much less about genetics contribution. And arguably, a research program that ignores genetics cannot provide a full picture of how SES is shaped. And recent developments in behavioral genetics give us the opportunity to broaden this picture. So in this paper, what we try to do is study the causal relationship between genetics, economic choices, and income. So our genetic measure is a polygenic index for educational attainment, which I will refer to as the EAPGI. I'll explain what it is in a second. And in order to estimate the causal effects of this EAPGI, we take advantage that if you condition on the polygenic scores of the parents, then the variation that's left in the offspring's PGI is actually random. So if you think about it, it's like you take a set of parents, their genetics is fixed, but what is actually the genes that are going to be transmitted to their children, that's actually random. So what is a polygenic index? Is really just an exercise in prediction. So think about this Xij as really your genetic data. I here is indexing the individual. J is indexing a part of the genome. So you have this huge vector for this individual. And we're going to turn this into a single number that basically tells us about the genetic predisposition of this individual towards some outcome, in our case, educational attainment. So you're going to need those weights, those WJ. They come from genome-wide association studies. I'm not going to be able to have time to talk about them, but basically, like, you're trying to choose these weights in order to maximize the predictive power of this. And importantly, it's done in a different sample, so you don't have overfitting. And when we do that, this PGI explains about 12% of the cross-sectional variation in educational attainment. So we use data on 44,000 individuals from the UK Biobank. Now, it's sort of important to emphasize that we restrict to participants from European genetic ancestries. There's a technical reason for that, and that's the standard in the literature. So that means there are no comparisons here across races, okay? So important to keep that in mind. And the empirical strategy is super simple. You have some outcome Y. I'm going to be regressing this on this polygenic score and controlling for the parent's polygenic score. And this beta should give us the causal effect of the APGI. So to try to convince you that I'm really estimating causal effects, if this was a randomized control trial and I'm arguing that this PGI is actually random, what would you do? You would sort of take baseline controls, stick on the left-hand side, and want to make sure that the beta is 0, basically that those things are orthogonal. So what I do here is take characteristics that are determined right at birth or shortly after, like year of birth or country or where people lived right after they were born. And first I'm just going to show you association. So each marker there is a different univariate regression of this characteristic on the APGI, and you see that those characteristics are associated with the APGI, and what is going to happen to those once we condition on the parental PGI, those relationships disappear, right? So once you condition on parental PGI, now the variation that's left in the APGI is basically orthogonal to the environmental circumstances into which those children were born. So for a subsample, we actually can look at more interesting characteristics of this individual's socioeconomic background. We can look at parental education and parental income, and the exercise gives you the same answer. Basically, like once you condition on the parental PGI, the variation that's left in the APGI is orthogonal to family SES. And the reason this is going to be important is that when I show you that the EAPGI has causal effects on educational and occupational choices, you want to keep in mind that those differences cannot be explained by differences in opportunities, okay? Because basically, like the poor and rich children have the same chances in the genetic lottery, or alternatively, individuals with low and high EAPGIs, they're coming from comparable socioeconomic backgrounds. So in principle, they would have faced the same opportunity sets. So I'll show all the results in figures. So for that purpose, it's going to be useful to use what I'm calling the residualized APGI. So you want to, that's just sort of the residuals from the regression of the offspring's PGI on the parental PGI. And because a lot of my outcomes are going to be binary and this epsilon is continuous, instead of showing like the expectation of y given epsilon, I'm going to do the opposite and actually show you the distribution of epsilon given y. Just so. Okay, so in the paper, we present 4 different sets of results. Here, today I'm going to give a flavor of 3 of them. So the first I'll show you that the APGI affects educational choices, it affects occupational choices, and affects income. Then the second set of results, we investigate what is the extent to which those 2 things are connected, right? So what is the extent to which these educational and occupational choices are actually mediating the relationship between the APGI and income. And the third exercise, like we take a step back and try to open the black box and ask like, but why is it that genetics affect economic choices? Why is it that individuals with different APGIs tend to make different economic choices? Okay, so first let me show you the effect of the APGI on education. So here I'm showing the distribution of the residualized APGI, so distribution of this sort of random part of the genetic variation, right? By whether individuals dropped out at the compulsory schooling age, so if they dropped out at as soon as they could, right? That's the black dashed line. And here's the distribution for those individuals that decide to stay in school past the compulsory schooling age, okay? So you can easily reject that those 2 distributions are the same. And to give you a sense of the magnitude, a 1 standard deviation increase in the APGI increases the likelihood that someone will stay in school past the compulsory schooling age by 2.7 percentage points. And about a third of the sample dropped out at the compulsory schooling age. The other thing that's sort of interesting to see about this figure is that you see that the 2 distributions share the same support, okay? And that just illustrates that when it comes to socio-economic outcomes and behaviors, genetics is not deterministic, right? So if you take any given value of the APGI, you have both stayers and dropouts, okay? So it affects likelihoods, but it's not deterministic. So let me show you that the effects of the APGI on occupation. So this first here, these are workers that are working in low SES occupations. Here are workers who work in higher socioeconomic status occupations. In terms of magnitudes, 1 standard deviation increase in the APGI causes workers to shift to occupations that typically pay 2.1% more. So the thing that I should have said, like what is standard deviation of the APGI, we normalize in such a way that this 1 standard deviation is just like the typical risk that someone faces in the genetic lottery, in the sense that's the typical deviation of what is the APGI of the child versus what would be expected given her parents, okay? In the paper, we show a lot of other interesting things, that individuals with high APGIs, they soar into occupations that require higher levels of education, that require higher levels of cognitive ability as well. So let me show you the effect of the APGI on income. Here now I'm showing you first the distribution for people that are in the bottom quarter of the income distribution. And here for people that are in the top quarter of the income distribution. And a 1 standard deviation increase in the APGI increases the likelihood that individuals will be in the top quarter of the income distribution by 1.7 percentage points. So I showed you that the APGI has effects on educational choices, on occupational choices, effects on income. Then we can then move on to the question of how those 2 things connected. So here I'm plotting what are the effects of the APGI on income. Income was reported in brackets. So I'm here sort of showing you what is the effect of the likelihood of someone having income above 18,000, 31,000, 52,000, 100,000 pounds, okay? And we're going to ask what is going to happen to this relationship when we now control for occupation and education. These effects reduce substantially. They fall by more than 30%, they lose statistical significance, suggesting that yes, one of the reasons why people with high APGIs have higher incomes is because of the educational and occupational choices that they make. Okay. In the paper, we actually leverage a natural experiment to conduct a proper causal mediation analysis, but here's what I have time to show today. So finally, we can take a step back and ask this question, okay, but how is it that genetics affects economic choices? Why is it that individuals with different genetics are making different economic choices? So we do two exercises. The first exercise we ask just like, how are these individuals that have different APGIs, how are they different, right? Maybe they have different characteristics that could potentially affect the decisions that they make. So here, of course, we're restricted by what's available in the data, but we can look at 4 different measures of cognitive ability. We can look at one personality trait, neuroticism, which is one of the big 5 personality traits, and then proxies for risk preferences. Okay. So basically, we don't find any effect on these 3 dimensions of cognitive ability, processing speed, visual and perspective memory, and we don't find any effects on risk preferences. Okay. We do find that the APGI increases fluid intelligence and reduces neuroticism. Okay. So then we can ask, well, okay, but do these characteristics, fluid intelligence and neuroticism, do they really mediate the relationship between the APGI and economic choices? So what we do here, first I'm show you the effect of the APGI on different measures of education and occupation, okay? And then we can ask what's gonna happen to this effects when first in the top panel we control for neuroticism, and in the bottom panel we control for fluid intelligence, right? So in the top panel, you see the red triangles show what happens when we control for neuroticism, and they barely change. They're on top of each other, so that tells us that neuroticism is not one of the mechanisms, it seems, for which the APGI affects economic choices. In the bottom panel, when we control for fluid intelligence, those effects, they do fall. They fall between from a quarter to as much as a third, okay? So they suggest that, yes, perhaps one of the reasons why individuals with different eAPGIs make different economic choices is because they have higher fluid intelligence. Notice, however, there's a very large portion of those effects that remains unexplained, right? So that tells us that even if intelligence plays a role, it's a limited role. There's still a lot that we don't understand, okay? The other exercise that we conduct to try to get at this question of why is it, how is it that genetics affects choices, is we look at the hypothesis raised by David Cesarini and co-authors that maybe genetics affects whose behavior it affects. In particular, we look at what the APGI affects present bias, present focus, however you want to call it. So we don't have direct measures of present focus. We have very rich data on behaviors that have been typically associated with present bias, such as overeating, excessive drinking, smoking, lack of physical exercise. So today, I'm just going to show you smoking. So non-smokers are the red solid lines. So you see that they tend to have higher APGIs, and a 1 standard deviation increase in the APGI reduces the likelihood that someone smokes by 1.3 percentage points. The paper show other interesting things like individuals with high APGIs, they sort of have lower body fat percentage, they're less likely to be obese, they have less alcohol-related hospital admissions, there's a biomarker for alcohol intakes also lower for them. So all suggests that perhaps present focus may be one of those mechanisms why genetics affect choices. Now, you could look at this and sort of say, well, Leandro, maybe this is just effective education. It doesn't seem like it, because like if we look at people at smoking behavior at age 16, and these cohorts are here such that they were obliged to be in school until age 16, you're still seeing difference. So basically, like the red and the black line, there's no difference in education between them, but you still see an effect. So to try to put this paper into sort of the context, we think we're contributing to 2 literatures. This literature on sort of the importance of genetics and family environment for intergenerational transmission of SES. We're more related to the sort of second part, which is recent papers that have used molecular genetic data. And I think our contribution is to improve this understanding of how this relationship between genetics, economic choices, and income. And then the literature, the empirical literature on the causal determinants of decision-making, which I think the psychology of poverty is part of that. I think about it as this way, and I think the contribution has shown that genetics also is one of also the causes that determines the decision making. So let me wrap up. So genetics affects education, occupational choices, and income, and showed some evidence that these choices do mediate the relationship. So one reason why individuals with higher APGIs have higher incomes is because of the education and occupational choices they make. Showed you some suggestive evidence that fluid intelligence and present focus may explain the effects of genetics on economic choices. Two things that I didn't have time today, where I think are to talk about, but I think are really important. One is that I showed the people that genetic effects are economically meaningful. I benchmarked them against effects, nurture effects. So there are papers sort of that use randomization of adoptees to adoptive families and try to estimate the effects of family environment. And I showed that the effects that I estimate are the same order of magnitude of those nurture effects. So ignoring this based on orders or whether they're economically meaningful, I don't think is sort of a valid argument. The other thing that's really important that is often overlooked is that I showed you all these effects of genetics, and people think about them sometimes as if they were biological and fixed. But this is a misconception. Those are a function of the environment. In the paper, I illustrate, I use a natural experiment changing policy, and I show that those causal effects of genetics on educational choices, they can change with policy, okay? The last bit that I should say is that, even if there are genetic variants, right, that have causal effects on something like wages, right, that may reflect that some people that have certain genetic variants are more productive in the labor market. But it could also reflect discrimination, right? Think about the sort of unimaginable world where women are as productive as men, but are paid lower wages. In this world, the XY chromosome would have a causal effect on wages. But that's not because men are more productive than women. It's just because of gender discrimination. So thanks so much.
Hi, this is Gautam Rao. I'm an economist. So that was a fascinating talk. One question I was wondering about is how much have you explored interactions between, parental, PGI scores and
yeah, so this data set, they don't have great measures of socioeconomic background. What we can do is use the parental PGI as a measure of SES, because parents with higher PGIs, they tend to be more educated and have higher income, so we can use that. So we can interact the effects of the APGI with the parental polygenic score. So here what I'm doing is sort of breaking the sample just based on whether your parents have a high PGI or low PGI, just splitting the half. And what you see is that interesting, for the lower level of education, which is CSC, O level, and O higher, then the genetic gift is actually better if you're in a low socioeconomic status family, right? But then when you go to sort of college level, those things flip, and actually having a sort of greater APGI is buying you more if you are in a sort of in a higher SES family. And that's also true for income, which I find fascinating. So when you look at lower levels of income, the genetic gift basically sort of has a larger effect if you're in a lower SES family, but as you go sort of to higher levels of income, those effects basically are the same irrespective of the SES of your family.
Nick Otis. I'm a PhD student in health economics. So I have a question about reverse causality and whether there could be an epigenetic factor at play. So whether the environment could shape what genes are being turned on and off in people.
Yes, the environment can change which genes are on and off. It's actually sort of one of the areas in which I'm sort of going to, but here is it's just genetic data. There's no epigenetic data. So this is all sort of determined at conception and nothing changes. Yeah. So unfortunately, yeah, you wouldn't capture any sort of changes in gene expression in this data.
Hi. So maybe this is too much of a stretch, but I was wondering if there is some public policy lessons that could be learned from the paper and some policies that could be implemented from those findings.
Yeah, I'll politely sidestep this question. And I'll say what I think, how this is useful for science. So I think the first thing is like, if you are in a world where you don't have an instrument, you're looking at correlations. I mean, it's important to control for genetics. That may help you. Even if you have an instrument, if you have a randomized experiment or something like that, it may reduce your residual variance, so it may get you more precise estimates. Then there are sort of understanding the gene by environment, right? Like even if you're just interested in how environment affect outcomes, these effects may differ with people's genetics, and that is important for policy and for interventions, and right. So we want to understand them. And finally, I mean, those are causal effects, right? I mean, those are generating inequalities, economic inequalities, right? And we want to think about them like, do we want to address them? Are they fair? People kind of like got lucky. So, I mean, I think there are a lot of open questions that.
Hi. I'm a master's student at University of San Francisco, and I have a very basic question. Could you tell us something about the sample? Like, what was the sample size, and how was it collected, and like, where did you get this data from?
Yeah, so this is called the UK Biobank. This was started by the National Health Services of the UK. So it's actually a sample of 500,000 people. They were all genotyped, so this data is publicly available. You just have to sort of apply to get access to this. I've focused on a sample of people that they have at least one sibling or parent that participate in the study, because that's what allows me to actually sort of impute what is the parental PGI. So there's a sort of a recent methodology developed to do that. So basically, I need genetics of 2 generations. So that's why I restrict to those 44,000 people, and to the people with European genetic ancestries, as I mentioned. Yeah, but the data, I mean, is fascinating. They linked with hospital inpatient data. They have like brain scanners. They did everything under the sun. It's sort of amazing. And the US is actually trying to do a biobank with 2 million people. NIH is trying to do something similar.
So yeah, we're just now going to open it up for questions for either Leandra or Monica. It looks like there was a question over there.
Hi, thanks. I'm Alika Hola. I'm from the World Bank. So I had a question for Leandro. So you might have mentioned this, but what is the magnitude of kind of explanatory power for this conditional PGI relative to, say, contextual factors that would be easily observable, right? Like some part of your economic context, like normal targeting, like your parental SES. Just because I ask, because, you know, if you're thinking about targeting, right, or even if you don't care about targeting, say you're just doing a randomized experiment and you're thinking about your residuals, it is very expensive to get a measure of your residual PGI, right? And so if thinking about like how much sense does it make to kind of scale up measurement of this, how much are we getting kind of over and above the predictive power of normal targeting variables?
Yes, so so that's what I tried to say my sort of before to last bullet point. Like, first, like I was just saying, like when you just take the sort of causal part, that explains from like 1% to 2% of the variation in educational attainment. Those are causal effects. That's what it explains. But I think to me, it's sort of, I've been sort of not worried, but like interested in this question, like, okay, but how large are those things? Like, should we really sort of care about them? So to me, the most satisfactory answer was this comparison, to try to say, okay, let me try to find causal effects of the family environment, right? Because that seems like the right animal to compare to. And to me, like the best estimates out there are of those studies that randomized children, right, into adoptive families. And those give you like causal effects of development in the environment, and you can compare that with the estimates of the causal effects of genetics. And basically, they're the same order of magnitude. So let me just give you an example. If a child is randomized into a family where the mother has a college degree, that increases the likelihood that the child herself is going to get a college degree by 10.2 percentage points. A 1 standard deviation increase in the APGI, which is a typical risk in the genetic lottery, is going to increase your likelihood to get a college degree by 3.5 percentage points. That's about a third. But I mean, it's the same order of magnitude. So I don't think that in terms of magnitudes, there's a good argument for ignoring them. Now, in terms of costs, yeah, it is expensive. But it's the kind of thing that, like, as sort of chips and technology, like the price that this sort of thing is decreasing of how easy or how inexpensive it is to genotype people is like decreasing at a really fast pace. So at some point, maybe it's not going to be that expensive. And I mean, those biobanks, like if you go up and look at biobank, right? This is like, I'm doing a socioeconomic study, but like they are using this data to study like so many diseases, right? They're sort of using all this sort of amazing administrative health data and seeing like how genetics actually affects health. So, and yeah, we social scientists are taking advantage of it, but there's a lot of really important stuff on health that's being done with this data.
Maybe one last question, if there is one, for either of our presenters. So now I think it's time, we have a break now, and so,
Yeah, we'll have a 10-minute break.